Good morning and welcome to Sunday School at First Baptist Church. I'm glad you could be here with us today as we open our study in the book of Jonah. We'll only be on this for 2 Sundays. It's a very short book in the minor prophets of the Old Testament. But it's sort of a unique book as far as prophecy books are concerned because Jonah is not written by the character. It's about Jonah, but we're not really sure who the author of the book is, but it does bear his name because it tells about Jonah. It's one of the books in the minor prophets that most people know because they know the story of Jonah and what happens to him, particularly up to the time that he gets swallowed by the fish and then he's spit out on the shore. With only a few exceptions in that book, Jonah is referred to in the third person, and it's only the book of Jonah and the 12 minor prophets that it's the story about the prophet himself and not a story that or a book that contains prophetic oracles. You know, the ones we've looked at so far, there are many visions and oracles that the prophet tells about. So Jonah is more along the lines of a parable, similar to the ones that Jesus told. In fact, there's some people who see this totally as an allegory, that they can't really find any factual things in history as far as where they would place Jonah, except that in the Kings, in the books of the Kings, Jonah is mentioned, and it would be about the time of Jeroboam II, which is put it in good place as far as what he prophesies about. The purpose of the book, it would seem to me, for us anyway, is what theologians would say is didactic. It's intended to teach, but there is, as one author said, a spirit of prophetic writing. And so we'll approach it that way. We're going to look at the story and we're going to look at the spirit of prophecy that's in there. Just a quick summary of what's there. There's only 48 verses in the entire book, and it's written in simple prose. The first part tells about Jonah's rebellion against God's call. The second part is about the Lord's retrieval and recommissioning of Jonah to go ahead with his call. The third part tells about his preaching in Nineveh, the capital of Assyria, a place where he really didn't want to be and he tried to run away from it. And then the successful result of that. And then Jonah's complaint at the Lord for his compassion toward Nineveh. Jonah was a Hebrew. He didn't like the Assyrians. And then finally, in the end, God's reproof of this pouting prophet to teach him this lesson. So let's look and get right into the book and look at the first 3 verses in chapter 1. Verse 1 says, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went on board and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. First thing I want us to look here is the word of the Lord in verse 1. We're not told how this message of judgment came to Jonah for Israel's archenemy of Assyria, but specifically he is told to go to Nineveh and preach against the wickedness of Nineveh. It was going to be a sermon or preaching against and delivering judgment on Nineveh. Jonah went, but he went in exactly the opposite direction, as far away from Nineveh as he could. Now Tarshish, if you look at the map, it was in southern Spain on the other end of the Mediterranean from Israel, beyond which there was nothing but ocean as far as the people of Jonah's day knew. Tarshish was to a Hebrew at the other end of the world, because this was the known world for those people. Every step of Jonah's journey was aimed at escaping the presence of the Lord. Dr. John Strange, who for many years taught at New Orleans Baptist Seminary, said in a sermon on Jonah, he called Tarshish anywhere but the right place. And Nineveh was the place where people in any place who are in need of the gospel. That's where he was supposed to be, but he was heading to Tarshish, anywhere but the right place. Now, God said to Jonah, go and preach. Dr. J. Hardy Kennedy characterized what Jonah did as defiant disobedience. He had been given a command. This is not a request. God says to Jonah, go and preach. It's a serious call. It's a command that's not given by a man, by a mere man, as Dr. Kennedy says, but Yahweh God. And because the person and the character of God, the mighty word of divine declaration is both heard and heeded. It has to be, because if you don't, then you're bypassing a serious obligation. In fact, Dr. Kennedy says obedience to God is the most serious obligation of man, and I would agree with that. Obedience to what God wants you to do, that's the most serious obligation that we all have. Despite Jonah's sad response of disobedience, it is of inestimable importance is the fact that Jonah could hear and understand God. You know, a lot of times we wonder about that in our own lives. Is God speaking to me? Right now in our church, we're doing a series of studies in our homes with home groups entitled Experiencing God. And one of the things that we're talking about is listening for God to speak to you, because God still speaks to us. And in some cases it's unmistakable. In other cases we have to listen very carefully. So it's the most serious obligation of us, of mankind, to obey God. And we can hear and understand when God talks to us if we listen. Man has the capacity for this, and this capacity in man is distinctive. It's supremely distinctive. God speaks to us. Here then are two cardinal truths, as Kennedy says. God can and does speak to us. And second, we are constituted with moral nature that can encounter intelligibly and obey consciously the voice of God. God does speak to us, and we can encounter that message, and we can obey it if we will. Of supreme importance to us today is that God did speak to Jonah, and He still is in the business of speaking to us today. That's one of the things we can learn from the book of Jonah. And as we shall see, God doesn't simply take no for an answer. Not with Jonah and not with us. He just doesn't say, that's okay, I'll move on to the next person. Many people in the world today ignore God, and they assume that He also ignores them. Many believe that God set the world into motion, allows it to continue and go along unnoticed. The text portrays God as one who notices, and as God who is active, and as a God who takes sin seriously. And I think we'll see that in these verses today. Look at verses 4 and following. It says, then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, how can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe He will take notice of us, and we will not perish. Then the sailors said to each other, come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity. When the writer says here that God sent a great wind, if you read that in text in Hebrew, the verb that's used there is a word that is made to sound, that makes the sound of the wind as you say it, as it shrieks past those sails, and you say that word, it sounds like the sound of the wind. Now, Jonah's deep sleep, in my mind, when someone's in a great emotional state, one of the things that happens is their body gets really fatigued. How could he possibly sleep? Well, he was in a state of emotional despair and emotional distress, and his body was completely so tired that he fell asleep. It suggests that the conjunction that's used there, but, suggests that he's going down into the ship and falling into a deep sleep, and it's part of his rebelliousness against God. All the sailors working hard around to try to lighten the ship so it would ride higher in the water and wouldn't be swamped. And here's Jonah doing nothing. He's asleep. He's asleep at the wheel. The language used here has the root idea that's the same idea in Genesis 2:21 when God caused Adam to fall into a deep sleep, and from that deep sleep he took part of Adam and created Eve. This is the situation in which he finds himself. And they know not what to do at this point, and so they decided to test fate and find out if they think that somebody is responsible for this. And so they did it by casting lots, which is a common thing to do in the Old Testament, to cast lots to find out what they thought would be the truth. And so it says at the end of verse 7 in 7b, they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us who is responsible for making all this trouble for us. What do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what people are you?" He answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land." This terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" They knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. You know, in the Old Testament, beginning with Abraham and his descendants, they always wanted people to make sure that they knew that they were Hebrew, that they were a set-apart people. They were a different people, and that they followed Yahweh God. Billy K. Smith points out that this is but another example of God's providential control being magnified at every turn of this story. When they cast lots, it focused on Jonah. And so they knew that there was something special about this guy. They knew that something connected with him perhaps had caused the storm, and they wanted to find out from him what it was. Charles Spurgeon said that God never allows his children to sin successfully, and Jonah is proof of the truth of that statement. He could not sin successfully. It's unmistakably clear then to the men who attempt to resist and thwart the purposes of God, never to do so with personal, feeling like they're going to have personal impunity from it. You can't sin and expect that you're going to get away with it forever. There is judgment that comes. Obedience, then, is probably the most obvious lesson in this part of the book. Jonah was disobedient, and because of his disobedience, he was bringing things down on himself and on people who were with him. He attempted to run away from the presence of God, but you can't escape divine presence of God. You can't go far enough, and you can't shirk God's will. He's not going to allow you to do that. When he says, "I am a Hebrew and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven," notice that he's careful to, as I said, to indicate his own race and nationality. It was important to him. He had no intention of carrying a message to his enemies, although the opportunity to be they were the opportunity to receive the recipients of God's grace. He didn't want to go tell them how they could be saved. The people in Assyria were the enemies of the Hebrews, and he didn't want to tell them. Sennacherib had already tried to capture Jerusalem, and he didn't want to help them in any way. You know, Christ did not say in the Great Commission for us to go into the areas where people are like us. He said to go into all nations and to share the good news. There's a lesson for us here. Jonah was being narrow-minded. He was okay for sharing with people like him with his nationality, but he was not okay with sharing it with the people of Nineveh, the Assyrians. Now look what happens in verse 11. It says that the sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, "What should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us?" See, they had accepted that he was the problem. "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied, "and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon us." Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried to the Lord, "O Lord, please do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, O Lord, have done as you please." Jonah said, "The answer to this is get rid of me. I'm the problem. Throw me into the sea." And he was willing. He was willing to admit his own guilt. Now, lest you see this as some valiant gesture for Jonah and he's going to save these people, Jonah really, in my mind, in the minds of a lot of commentators, he'd rather die in the waters of the Mediterranean than to go and save Nineveh and preach to Nineveh about repentance. He did not want the Ninevites to receive the message of God. And so he told them, "Throw me into the sea." But these people said, "We're afraid God's going to hold us accountable for killing you." But he convinced them that that's what they should do. Even afterwards, they said, when they did throw him into the sea, they said, "We're going to have to offer a sacrifice for God for doing what we've done." So in verse 15 and 16, the deed is done. Then they took Jonah, they threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. It's here in verse 15 where, if you're studying in your Lifeway material, that our focal passage begins. One of the things that's always astounding to people in the Bible is when the sea grows calm at the result of someone's command. And particularly in the New Testament, when Jesus and his disciples were out on the sea and they were afraid because they thought they were going to perish, and the waves were high and they were in the boat, and Jesus calmed the storm in Mark 4. They looked at Jesus and they were filled with awe, it said. And they said to one another, "Who then is this that even wind and sea obey him?" And so I can imagine these sailors on the boat when they threw Jonah into the sea and he had told them that he was the problem. And then the sea immediately became calm. They said, "Oh my goodness, we have thrown God's favored son into the sea," or he's right, this is controlled by his God. But they said, "We'll have to offer a sacrifice." So what happens to Jonah? What happens to Jonah when he goes and sees? Everybody knows what happened to Jonah. But the Lord provided, verse 17, a great fish to swallow Jonah. And Jonah was inside the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Now I want you to notice this language carefully, because this is where so many people get lost. J. Hardy Kennedy said that many students of this passage get lost in the belly of the fish and are consequently robbed of the glorious message of this book. This is one of the most debated parts of the story, and many people will at this point say, let's figure out what fish that was. They want to identify the fish. And that's not what's important here, to identify the fish. It was that God used a fish to preserve Jonah's life after he'd been thrown overboard by the ship's crew, because God still had a mission for Jonah. When God has a mission, He's going to make sure that you can get through to that mission. The point of the author writing here is that God had a way of delivering Jonah, and that He intervened to save Jonah and reconscript him to the original call to go to Nineveh. And we're going to see that. We don't want to get lost in the belly of the fish or try to decide what kind of fish it was. Simply that God provided a great fish. That's what's important. When I was reading in Dr. Kennedy's account of the book of Jonah, he made some very worthy points about this whole thing. Here's what he said. It is said that Yahweh prepared the fish, not a whale, a fish, If one's God is a great God, if He is a creator and sustainer of the universe, there are really no problems here. Furthermore, if one's God is great enough, the miraculous elements are not disturbing, even to the modern mind. The verb rendered prepared means literally to number or to count. It does not affirm or suggest a special creative act of God, simply that the fish that swallowed Jonah was a particular fish, one numbered of God for place, time, and purpose, one for providential use. And that's what God did. This great fish, and it would have to be a great fish to swallow a man whole, just so the great God made a special appointment of a great fish, and for the specific purpose of swallowing up this rebellious prophet and then spitting him out on the shore later. From the human perspective, the real miracle lies not so much in Jonah being swallowed up by the big fish, but for him being preserved in the belly of the fish for 3 days and then being ejected again on the shore alive and well. Whether one treats this story as an allegory or an actual event in history, the meaning remains the same. God will go to great lengths to bring a person back in line with His will and purpose for that individual. He did it in Jonah's life. He's done it in other lives. He will continue to do that. God, who is the Lord of all, established the laws and order of nature, and He can supersede them. Lloyd Ogilvie says, in my limited observation of cause and effect, must never limit what I think God could have done. My limited observation as well. I've never seen a man swallowed by a fish, but it doesn't limit what I think God could have done and can do now. I don't see that on the horizon for anyone or for myself, but God can do wondrous things, and He has done them in the past. He will do them in the future. Now look at verses 1 and 2 in chapter 2. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, in my distress I called to the Lord, and He answered me. From the depths of the grave I called for help, and You listened to my cry. Now what he writes here is very much on the order of what we see in the book of the Psalms. It's a prayer of repentance, and it's recorded here in verses 2 through 9. It's the only section of the book that is specifically ascribed to Jonah as his words, and the only portion that is cast in poetic form. You know, I said it was part like the Psalms themselves. And so what does he do here? There are 4 things. He declares that God has answered his prayer. That's in verse 2. He recounts his distress. And then he talks about the divine rescue and the vow then to worship God. God's bringing him back. God's bringing him back to put him back in place and to be a part of his mission that God intended for him to be in the first place. In Psalms of this type, the person delivered from dire circumstances, not the result of his own sin, would put the emphasis on the Lord's graciousness to save. But here in this psalm, it's a result of Jonah's sin, and so he's the person who put himself in that position. The emphasis then is normally on the sin that required God's gracious deliverance. And Jonah does that. He's in dire straits. He's the one who must confess his sin. And so he does confess his sin. When Jonah was in the most desperate situation, he cried out to God, and he demonstrated his trust in God. Instead of running anymore, he turns and he cries out, and he says that he's seeking God's forgiveness. He began the prayer by recalling this, how he called to the Lord in distress and how the Lord answered his prayer. And if I were in the belly of a fish, I'd call to God in distress too. He declared, he cried out from the deep in the realm of the dead. In other words, Jonah was as good as dead when he lifted his voice in prayer. His praying to the Lord demonstrated that he still trusted God. He might have run from God, but he still trusted God, and now he had been brought to his senses. The focus of the beginning of his prayer was on Jonah's desperate need for deliverance and the Lord's willingness to hear his cry. Look at verses 3 and 4. He says, you hurled me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. You know, he wasn't claiming that God did something wrong. He said, I know you did this. You did this to bring me back to my senses. And so what am I going to do? I'm going to look at your holy temple. I'm going to look in that direction, figuratively speaking. And he's going to see the sovereign hand of God working in his life. And he says, even the billows and the breakers that were in the ocean were God's instruments. They were doing his bidding. He recognizes God's power. He has control over the ocean. And for this reason, he prayed and he called on God to rescue him. In contrast to Jonah, even the waves and the billows of the seas were faithful servants of God. You see, Jonah was headed in the wrong direction. He wasn't a faithful servant. But the waves and the billows of the sea did God's bidding when he asked them to. As Jonah was thrust into the very heart of the seas and currents swirled about him, he recognized that the Lord was ultimately in control of his life. And even now, in the belly of a fish, God could save him. Now, I would be preparing for, the end of my life. But not so. Jonah recognized that God could save him because he knew who got him there. Look at verses 5 through 9 at the rest of the prayer. He says, the engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever. But you brought my life up from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was ebbing away, I remember you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols forfeit the grace that could be theirs. But I, with a song of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. Salvation comes from the Lord. He's turning around here. And he's saying, God, I'm ready now. I'll do what you want me to do. He talks about being plunged into the sea and what all happened to him on the way to the bottom, and that it appeared that all hope was lost. In fact, he says, I sank down. That's where he had been headed all since God had called him. He was going down. In fact, it says when he rebelled against God, he went down to Joppa. He went down inside the ship. Now he was going down to the bottoms of the mountains under the ocean. And at some point, the great fish met him, and he went down into the fish's belly. When you turn your back on God, the only direction then is to go down, because that's where you're headed. He said, my life was ebbing away, and he knew that the only deliverance for him was through God. And so this miraculous preservation in the belly of a great fish begins to happen. God gave Jonah a purpose to live. He was now going to accept. He was going to accept his marching orders, and he was going to go to Nineveh. No, God would not allow Jonah to die. Through the discipline of distress, Jonah found his purpose to live. God can always help the wandering sinner find a purpose and a direction. And He can save you from anything. He can save you from any circumstance that you find yourself. Where's because his prayer, one that was born out of affliction, he was acknowledging that God was disciplining him and that he deserved it. And now he was ready to go. He remembered his Lord. He acted on the basis of his commitment. Jonah knew God's covenant promises and he claimed them. This song of thanksgiving, one writer says that thanksgiving is the very essence of prayer. And that's what Jonah was doing in this situation. It was the essence of Jonah's prayer out of the stomach of the great fish. And it was his resolution that broke against the providence of judgment that proved in the end to be mercy. He was judged. The ship was in the storm. He was thrown overboard. He was swallowed by a great fish. And guess what? That was God's mercy working on him because he was saved by the great fish. There's a fundamental change of his attitude and of his spiritual progress, and he was ready to accept God's direction. Salvation comes from God. At the end of that text, it said, salvation is of Jehovah. He's convinced of that, and he's repentant in his spirit and confessing God's supremacy. At a great price, Jonah had learned some lessons. Lloyd Ogilvie writes that we learn two important things from Jonah's prayer. One, first, the prayer shows how to pray in the midst of failure, when our distress has been caused by our own disobedience. And that's where Jonah was. He learned how to pray in the face of failure. And then second, we learn how to thank God for confronting us with our disobedience. God will always make you aware of your sin. He will always make you aware of your sin. Now, you may choose to ignore it, but God will make you aware of what your sin is. And then at the end of this is what happens in verse 10. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. Warren Wiersbe puts a colorful twist to this scripture. I thought this was an interesting way to describe it. It's an ignominious way for a distinguished prophet to arrive on the shore. In chapter 1, the sailors treated Jonah like a dangerous cargo to be thrown overboard. And now he's treated like a foreign substance to be disgorged from the fish's body. Regardless, Jonah was now free to obey God and do what God wanted him to do. However, Jonah still had many lessons to learn, and that'll be the subject of our next lesson. For sure, one of the most important things that we can learn from this passage in Jonah is that apart from God, we can do nothing. Jesus said, I'm the vine, you are the branches. If a man resides in me, then he produces much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. So Jonah was in that situation. He was helpless because he was apart from God. When he became separated from God by sin, we need to pray, as did the psalmist did long ago, restore unto me the joy of my salvation. That's basically what Jonah did. Restore unto me. J. Hardy Kennedy writes in his commentary, the way is clear. Healing for the mind and peace for the soul and power for creative living are to be found again where they were found before, at the foot of the cross. The great hymn writer Fanny Crosby captured that idea with these words. Jesus, keep me near the cross, there a precious fountain, free to all, a healing stream flows from Calvary's mountain. In the cross be my glory ever, till my ransomed soul shall find rest beyond the river. Near the cross a trembling soul, love and mercy found me. There the bright and morning star shed his beams around me. Near the cross, O Lamb of God, bring its scenes before me. Help me walk from day to day with its shadows o'er me. Near the cross, I'll watch and wait, hoping, trusting ever, till I reach that golden strand just beyond the river. Jesus, keep me near the cross, there a precious fountain, free to all a healing stream, flows from Calvary's mountain. In the cross, be my glory ever, till my ransomed soul shall find rest beyond the river. That's my prayer for you today, that your soul finds rest in God, in Jesus Christ, who paid the price for us on the cross of Calvary. I hope you have a good week.